Homel. I'm a member of the Lithuanian community of BC. I am a post-secondary college and university teacher from 1973, pretty well up to the present, with some specialties in European studies, 20th century. And today we're going to be looking at book smuggling with regard to Eastern Europe and Lithuania in particular. Language. Cultures are best described as a house of words. Mm-hmm. A house of words. The use of language is what defines and what shapes and creates a culture at the broadest sense. And we know that language is a key determinant of cultural maintenance. We don't have to look any further than Canada. French Canada, from the time of the conquest around 1760 up to the present, has maintained its cultural distinctiveness by insisting upon French as a language of national life there. And there's other examples. I mean, here at home, we can talk about First Nations languages as a fount of First Nations cultures. Unfortunately, dominant or imperial nations try to subsume other languages and culture, a part of a colonial process that we can see not just in the third world, but in North America as well. And so in that struggle, languages of smaller minority nations or cultures get threatened with being subsumed. And one of the aspects of that is to ban books, books being the source of the use of language as a house of words. And so we've had book bannings over the years, over the centuries, really. And book bannings have left the need to smuggle or import books against the dominance of authorities. And sometimes censorship of books is done for political dominance and control, as I've suggested. Other times, censorship has been done as a matter of artistic censorship. And when I thought about smuggling of books, I often thought about the smuggling of James Joyce's literary masterpiece, Ulysses, in the 1920s and early 30s into Britain, Canada, the United States, because it, along with many other modernist novels, were under censorship. And smuggling was done of Ulysses, sometimes with the result that people trying to enter Britain from France were caught with a copy of Ulysses. So smuggling was sometimes done to help preserve a culture by those heavily invested in the survival of that culture. And I want to end my introduction. I will be introducing speakers, of course, by mentioning the two smuggling instances that we'll be talking about today. The first is smuggling Lithuanian language books under the nose of imperial Tsarist Russia from the 1860s until 1904, when that repression was ended. And this involved quite a lot of different private underground societies dedicated to preserving the Lithuanian language despite Imperial Russia's restriction on publishing, using Latin letters that we use rather than Russia's Cyrillic script. So Lithuanian book smugglers used ingenious tactics to smuggle books hidden in their packs and their cargo under other goods, proving their intense desire to the language. And the second example we've got here in terms of book smuggling is the effort by the German Nazis during World War II in conquering Lithuania by Jewish victims to save the huge archive and library based in Vilnius of Jewish culture that we know as YIVO, Y-I-V-O, and I'm sure we're probably all familiar with that. I just want to end by pointing out that those smuggling efforts, which are detailed in a really good book called The Book Smugglers, Partisans, Poets, and the Race to Save Jewish Treasures from the Nazi by David Fishman, had the help of Christian Lithuanians in Vilnius at the time, such as a librarian, Ona Shemate, who concealed these valuable materials, notably in the basement of a church in Vilnius. And in recent years, those materials were recovered and have been restored on a shared basis between Lithuania and YIVO in New York. So I always thought that this topic of the use of language, of books as a fount of culture, has always been really interesting. So I want to introduce the first speaker, and that's Marita Racis, a retired librarian at the Seattle Public Library, familiar to all of us in the Lithuanian community, formerly at the Talking Book and Braille Library for the state of Washington, as she worked in Seattle for many years at the public library. Marita studied English Lit at Victoria University, Toronto, part of University of Toronto, which was very special in English Lit, and has completed grad studies in library sciences, also at University of Toronto. She's been a professional librarian for 51 years in the US, as I mentioned, and in Canada. She completed training at the Academy of Theatre Arts in Toronto and has had lifelong interest in Eastern philosophy and ancient yoga teachings. Although a mediocre singer, she claims, and I haven't had the chance to test her out, Marita is passionate about singing in Lithuanian and has been a member of Seattle's Lithuanian choir for 10 years plus. So she will read from her joint translation of the memoirs of a pioneer in Lithuania working on labor rights and women's rights from the late 19th century into about 1920 or so. So Marita, take it away.
Thank you. Thank you, Jane, for that lovely introduction and for mentioning about my passion for singing. And this obviously relates to language because we sing in the Lithuanian language in our choir in Seattle, and that's my way of keeping up with the language. And I'm passionate about it, but I'm even more passionate about the author I'm going to speak about. Her name, pen name is Žemaitė, and her full name was Julia Benevičiūtė Žemantienė. She was born of the gentry in 1845 in a manor house near Plungė, Lithuania, and that was in the northeast corner of the country. She was educated in a rich aunt's house, which was fortunate because then only boys were educated. She married a serf, Larina Žymantas, in April 1866, and this is rather significant because it was akin to marrying a slave here in North America. She did not think about marrying down. She wanted to marry the man she loved. They had 6 children. She lived the life of a subsistence level farm wife. She started writing at age 49. She wrote by candlelight at night while her alcoholic husband slept. Žemaitė moved to Vilnius in 1912 after her husband's death. She traveled to the US during World War I and raised money on her own, $30,000 US, by journalism, talks, and sent it all back to Lithuania during the famine there. She was already a famous writer when coming to the US, and for all that, she remained humble. She never took her scarf off. This was who she was. She declared with her outfit, and they couldn't get that fancy fur hat on her or anything. And she continued writing to her until her last days when she died of pneumonia in 1921. Žemaitė was and is beloved by her countrymen and women. To honor her, the Lithuanians put her image on the litas, the $1 bill, and the Lithuanian stamp. Claiming her as a Bolshevik in quotes, the Soviets erected a huge bronze statue of her in the capital Vilnius and put her on the Russian stamp. Žemaitė was not only a powerhouse writer, but a humanitarian and an activist for all unjust causes, such as, well, especially women's rights. And she had indomitable willpower, obviously, determination, and compassion. My great-grandmother, yes, she was my mother's grandmother, I'm proud to say, put a mark in her time and in the world. We owe her a great deal, and to others like her, such as the booksellers, the book smugglers, who preserved our Lithuanian language, even at the risk of their lives. And this is probably best described by Žemaitė herself in her autobiography, in the passage which I'm going to read, and it is titled, "My Longing to Read." As I mentioned earlier, I always longed to read, but there was always a shortage of books for me. Wherever I could get some, I borrowed them to read. But most often, I only got religious books that my sister would get from the priests or bought jealous ones for herself, sticking me with all kinds of heavens and hells. When we moved to the Brothers, I became acquainted with the neighboring gentlemen. They took an interest in me, how I came to speak Polish so well. I used this to get Polish books to read. We didn't worry about Lithuanian writing. Lithuanian writings were prohibited, and that was that. In addition, I taught my children to read and write in Polish. One of our neighbor's sons was at the Charlet Gymnasium. When we went there, he was still only in his first year. When he came home for the summer or holidays, he always played and ran around with my kids. Looking at the children, pain would pierce my heart. Why can't I send my child to the gymnasium? As Papa Lucas was going back to Cholet, one person asked him to buy this, another that, giving him money, and I also asked him to lend me some books to read. Several times he brought back a couple of books, and after I read them, he took them back again. All they could get were Polish books. A rumor started making the rounds that in Prussia they were publishing Lithuanian writing. But if they caught them bringing them to our part of the country, the Ruskies punished them fiercely. During their sermons, the priest started to frighten people away from the forbidden works. It was not enough that it was a sin to transfer and distribute them or sell the godless works, but it was a greater sin to read them because they were written by atheists, Germans, and non-Catholics. It was not enough to lose your soul with these kinds of readings. You could incur the government's punishment, jail, or deportation to concentration camps. Such curiosity came over me, somehow, somewhere, to at least get to see these works. But no such luck. You couldn't even ask about them. Do you want to get caught yourself and get others in trouble? Were people's first reproach. Well, then keep still. One time, Papa Lucas came home for Christmas. The very same evening, he came running over to us. He looked so happy, jumping up and down, saying, "Auntie, You won't believe what kind of treat I brought. Pulling a book out of his shirt, he showed me. Look, you never saw anything like this yet. Tearing it out of his hands, I looked, and even my eyes dimmed. The newspaper, Ausha, in book form. The whole year's copies sewn together. Shemaitiškai Lowland Lithuanian, I shouted in surprise. I leafed through it, reading it, and could not believe my eyes. My hands were shaking. I just read you a little bit of the ending there in Lithuanian so you can get a feel for the language before it was translated. Čiočia, nesitikėjai. Kokį, I can't see it, sorry. Kokį parvežiau pyragą, ištraukęs iš užančio knygelę. Žiūrėk, tokios nematei dar. Pagrobos jam iš nagų žiūriu, net man akis pabalo. Aušros knygelė, visų metų susiųsta. Žemaitiškai nustebus sušukau, vartau ir skaitau ir savo akimis nenori tikėti. Rankos man dreba. That was 1921 and the end of her autobiography. And unfortunately, nothing more was written by her because it was 1921 and she did die in 1921. So here ends my part. Thank you. And thank you for having me on.
Thank you. That's great. I have a lot of questions, or a few questions, about what's been mentioned, particularly you mentioned Polish. Maybe we'll get to some of those points later on.
Sure.
Okay, next speaker is Rachel Mines, or Minus, as you would say in the native tongue. Rachel Mines has been translating Yiddish since around 2016. Her first translation of Yiddish writer Yona Rosenfeld, a book called The Rivals and Other Stories, was published by Syracuse University Press in 2020. And now she's got a second collection published by Syracuse University Press of short stories by the same fellow, Yona Rosenfeld. It's called A Plague of Choleras. It's being published now. Rachel's father was a Holocaust survivor born in Skuodas, Lithuania, which is something like 10 kilometers from the border with Latvia up in the northeast. And he was born in 1909 and lived in Skuodas and then later in Kaunas, at that time the capital of Lithuania, until his deportation under the Holocaust in 1941. Rachel's proud to say she's recently had her citizenship reinstated by the Lithuanian government with a passport to boot. So here is Rachel Mines.
Hey, thank you for the introduction, Jean. I should mention that actually Marita and I come from the same part of Lithuania, so or our ancestors did, so we're neighbors, or landsmen, as we'd say in Yiddish. So today I'm going to read from a yet unpublished story by Yona Rosenfeld that's coming out in the new collection that will be published next month, in about 3 weeks. And Yona Rosenfeld was a Jewish Yiddish-speaking writer born around 1880 in Chartoryisk, Russia at the time, and now a part of present-day Ukraine. Yona Rosenfeld had a traumatic past. He was raised in extreme poverty. His parents were killed in a cholera epidemic when he was 12. Before he was 13, he was earning his own living in Odessa under the cruel Russian apprenticeship system, in which apprentices were more or less bought and sold like slaves. Rosenfeld was brutalized for years by his cruel boss, As a young man, despite knowing nothing about literature, Rosenfeld became a writer. His works were popular in the Yiddish press in Europe and the US until he died in New York in 1944. Unfortunately, the number of people able to read Yiddish has drastically diminished since the Holocaust, and Rosenfeld, together with untold other Yiddish writers, has been almost completely forgotten. I began translating his stories into English so that they could continue to be read and enjoyed around 2018. The story I'm about to read from is from my collection of translated stories, A Plague of Cholera, and Other Stories by Yona Rosenfeld that will be published next month. Now, you might wonder what Yona Rosenfeld, who lived in Ukraine, Poland, and the US, has to do with Lithuania, but there is a direct connection. The book that contains the original of the story, the original Yiddish of the story excerpt I'm about to read, was hidden in the Vilnius ghetto during World War II to, as Jean mentioned, protect them from the Nazis. Book smugglers in the Vilna ghetto hid thousands of volumes to save them from destruction, and after the war, the books remained hidden in various locations around Vilnius to protect them from Soviet occupiers who would have destroyed them. Since then, the books have been digitized by the Lithuanian State Central Archives, and they're now available online. So that's how I was able to access the original Yiddish of this story that I'm about to read from. So I'm going to read from Rosenfeld's story, titled in English, The Old and the Young. This haunting psychological portrait, which is far ahead of its time in its depiction of what we would now call PTSD, shows us some of the long-lasting effects of persecution and brutality. Okay. The snow reached almost halfway to the top of the cellar apartment's window when old Meyerwolf got up at dawn for work. The minute he saw the whiteness piled up on the other side of the glass, he was struck by the odd notion that it wasn't actually snow, but rather a pair of nameless ghosts, spirits from some unknown faded world that had come to visit him and were waiting outside with their pale backs pressed against the window pane. It was no colder inside than it had been yesterday before the snowfall, but he could still feel the snow breathing its icy breath through the glass. It was dark in the house, and Meyerwolf couldn't decide if the snow was making the inside darker or the outside brighter. It had to be one or the other, he thought. It couldn't be both. It seemed, however, that the darkness inside and the daylight outside had come to a tacit agreement to find the middle ground. And in the shadows of the courtyard, the snow blanketed the earth like the pale dregs of a dark night or a lifeless dawn. The old man walked into the kitchen and looked glumly at the sewing machine that stood in front of the window. He struck a match on the black stove, it was still faintly warm, and lit the tin lamp with its sooty glass, after which he washed his hands and said the blessing. Then, in a soft, mournful voice, he began the morning prayers. When Meyerwolf sat down at the sewing machine, the first thing he saw was the image in the two snow-covered bottom panes of the window, an indistinct figure which, since it was his own reflection, should have looked exactly like him, but didn't. His white beard was invisible in the white mirror, and though his black jacket and hat stood out distinctly, his face was wraith-like, a foggy blur with a pair of glasses glittering on the misty, barely visible nose. The old man suffered from a strange malady. He was afraid of mirrors. He'd had this fear ever since the pogrom, in which his wife, son, and elderly father had been murdered. Meyerwolf's hair and beard had gone gray overnight from grief. The first time he'd seen himself in a mirror, with his silvery beard making him look just like his dead father, something in his brain gave way, and he started screaming that the reflection wasn't his own. And for some reason, that confusion still lingered. His father, it seemed, hadn't been murdered, but had taken possession of him, hiding inside him, or somehow becoming him. Meyerwolf no longer knew whether he was his father or his father's son. Most likely his father, he thought, or Maybe he was both at the same time. But if that was so, then who had been killed? The old man sat working at his machine with a disquieting awareness of the eerie figure, only its upper half visible, sitting across from him, imitating every one of his movements. This impersonator, which must have arrived with the snow from some faraway world, a dead white world, was now peering at its white-haired counterpart through the window and calling him away. Marwolf knew that the ghostly image was really his own reflection, and was surprised that it had no beard. Where had it gone? And then a new thought struck him. The image must be his younger self, enveloped in an outer appearance of hoary old age, and returned in a dream, having fallen along with the snow from the heavens above. The old man sat working, still glancing up from time to time, but now the fear he'd felt when he'd first seen the reflection was slowly fading. He was seeing himself as a youth. His fear dwindled from one glance to the next until he was staring at the blurred figure, astonished to realize it wasn't himself, but his son. Of course, it was his murdered son, who for some reason was wearing his father's jacket. It was his son, looking just like his father, Meyerwolf, when he'd been a young man, and Meyerwolf looked just like his own father, and all three were somehow simultaneously one being. All three were amazingly identical, and all three lived inside him. Or perhaps it was he who lived inside the two others. And though Meyerwolf knew that the image across the room wasn't really his son, he couldn't escape the disorienting sensation that he was sitting here in the window watching his son. That he was sitting here in the kitchen watching his son reflected in the window. A wave of depression overwhelmed the old man. He couldn't work anymore. The kitchen was still freezing cold. A white strip of snow, packed into the gap at the bottom of the door that opened to the outside, breathed its melancholy breath into the dark, dirty kitchen, filling the room with an icy chill. Meyerwolf stood up from his chair and noticed that the reflection's head, which was either his son's or his father's, he still couldn't decide, had vanished. The black jacket, visible from the shoulders down, was all that remained. The head was gone, effortlessly detached from its body, and for some reason it suddenly dawned on the old man that this was an omen. He was about to die. The thought didn't particularly bother him. In fact, it felt perfectly natural, and the idea he'd just had, to go back to bed, seemed somehow connected with the omen he'd just been given, because never before in his life had he gotten up in the morning and then gone straight back to bed. The old man stood motionless for a few minutes and then slowly walked into the dark room he'd left a half hour ago, tiptoed over to his bed, took off his boots and heavy jacket, and crawled under the covers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rachel Mines. I might also mention in terms of Lithuania that Rachel is preparing a third volume, potentially, of a author who was born and raised in Lithuania, in the same region, more or less, and then immigrated to New York. And so we'll look for those short stories translated into English in the future. Okay, our third reader or speaker is Helen Mintz. Helen came out with a 2006 translation of short stories by Karpinovitz. It's called Vilna, My Vilna, which is a collection of stories about Vilnius during the interwar period before World War II. And it really is focused on the, I guess, poorer elements of the community in most instances. And it's very interesting that way in recreating life in Vilnius during that period. Her book, Vilna, My Vilna, garnered 3 literary awards, and she's since completed the translation of a second collection of stories by Karpinovitz of Vilna-themed work. This is a writer who ultimately moved to Israel. Three of Helen's grandparents grew up in the area around Vilnius. When she visited the city for the first time to attend a Yiddish course at Vilnius University in the summer of 2004, she was surprised and heartened how familiar the city felt to her, how much like home. And we were fortunate enough to meet up and attend those sessions at Vilnius University with Helen. So here she is, Helen Mintz. Please take it away. Thanks.
Thank you. So I'd like to thank you, Jean, for that introduction. And I want to thank the Lithuanian Association of BC for organizing this event, and also all of the other panelists and all of you who are listening on Zoom. It feels like a real honor to be participating as a Yiddish translator in a Lithuanian hosted event. So thank you. I'm honored to present an excerpt from a short story by Avram Karpinowicz, or as we call him in Yiddish, Avram Karpinovich. Karpinovich was born in 1913 in the multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multilingual city known to Jews as Vilna. He left Vilna in 1937, fortunately, and therefore did not witness the murder of 95% of Vilna Jews by the Nazis, nor did he witness the destruction of many of the important Jewish landmarks in the city.
Hello, Svetlana speaking.
Hello, this is Daniel Klein from Sharon Tzedek. I'm going to be delivering your Mishloach Manot from Sharon Tzedek Synagogue.
I will silence whatever that is.
Able to come down, please.
So when are you planning to come in here? Because I plan to go downtown to the rally.
Okay.
It's Svetlana Ershoff.
Ah, it's
Yeah,
great.
it is.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
My apologies. I just muted Svetlana, so please
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay, I'm going to start over again, and the glories of Zoom. So yeah, as I said, fortunately for Karpinovich, he left Vilna in 1937 and therefore did not witness the murder of 95% of Vilna Jews, nor did he witness the destruction of many of the important urban landmarks of Jewish life in Vilna perpetrated by the Soviets after the war. After the Holocaust, Karpinovich moved to Israel, where he wrote extensively in Yiddish and was awarded the prestigious Monger Prize. In his writing, Karpinovich memorializes through love and humor the Jewish world of Vilna, and particularly, as Jean mentioned, the world of the lower and marginal classes. Karpinovich at one point said, quote, "To earn the right to his pen, the writer must love his protagonists. He must understand them and sympathize with them." And though Karpinovich was fluent in at least 8 languages, and he is a post-Holocaust writer, he chose to write in Yiddish, the language of his beloved characters, even though most of the readers of that language had been annihilated. After Lithuania achieved independence, Karpinovich visited Vilnius a number of times to share his work, and I know he would be absolutely delighted to learn that his work has been translated into Lithuanian and produced by Lithuanian theatrical groups. Avram Karpinovich's father, Moshe Karpinovich, was an impresario for the Yiddish theater, and he organized theatrical tours for a number of writers and theater artists, including Sholem Aleichem, and he helped to run a series of very popular Yiddish theaters in Vilna. A number of Karpinovich's stories, including the one that I will read from today, entitled Zubak, give us a glimpse into the detailed workings of the Yiddish theater and the intimate lives of its actors. This story, which was published in the original in Yiddish in 1967, is part of a forthcoming second collection of English translations that I've done of Karpinovich's Vilna stories. And a bit of background to the story I'm about to read. During the 30s, many Vilna Jews lived in modest, low-rise apartment buildings that were clustered around a very shabby central courtyard. And the courtyard gate would be locked at a certain point in the evening. And in order to gain entry into the courtyard, in order to get into one's own apartment, the inhabitants had to pay the janitor a certain fee to reopen the gate. Zubak. Okay, just a second. That season, the Vilna Theater staged Der Jiddischer Hamlet, the Jewish Hamlet. Zubak played the dead father. He had to stand for an entire act until the curtain fell, wrapped in a white sheet with a lamp burning behind him. The director, Straitman, wanted a long, good-looking corpse, and the tall, skinny Zubak was perfect for the role. At first, he kicked up a fuss, threatening to leave the troupe if he wasn't given a few lines before returning to the coffin. But everyone in the theater knew that Zubak was just talking. He loved the profession much too much to quit. And then Zubak tried to get Straitman to rewrite the play so he could die earlier and get home before the courtyard gate was locked. That way he could save the 10 groschen he'd have to pay the janitor to open it. Straitman yelled, "Drang! Derech Eretz for Shakespeare! You beanpole! Have some respect for Shakespeare!" Feeling humiliated, Zubak went backstage to whiten his face for the performance. Things hadn't been going well for Zubak. He hadn't had any lines, and so he lost his salary. It had actually been a number of seasons since he'd had a speaking role, ever since he'd flubbed his lines and announced, "Mr. General, the lady has a tail," instead of "the lady has a veil." After that, Straitman treated Zubak like his mortal enemy, and he had good reason. The scene was supposed to be tragic, but the audience had split their sides laughing. Someone in the hall even heckled, "Zubak, she's not a piece of meat." And now Zubak was trying to save the 10 groschen for the janitor, which amounted to no more than a few zlotys a month. But Zubak needed every groschen to survive. The rear door of Svirsky's bakery opened into the courtyard where Zubak lived. Theater performances usually ended just as the bread was going into the oven, and Zubak would hurry through the bakery without disturbing anyone, and from there into the courtyard. But the last time he tried to hurry past the hearth broom standing next to the hot oven, Svirsky blocked his way and informed him, "The janitor is accusing me of edging in on his earnings. He keeps asking me how you get home at night without getting through the front gate." Really, Svirsky didn't give a hoot about the janitor, but he continued to Zubak, "I don't have a problem if one of the actors goes through the bakery, as long as I get something in return." Zubak was very touchy, and he waited impatiently to hear what Svirsky wanted. The baker whispered to his 2 apprentices, Shneke and Tevela, the devils, and then told Zubak that as payment for going through the bakery, he'd have to sing or dance, whichever he preferred. In the wink of an eye, Shneke and Tevela were standing next to Zubak, begging him, Zubak, singt uns op dem couplet von Schloime Gorgel. Zubak, sing us the ditty from Schloime the Brawler. And without waiting to hear Zubak's response, the pair burst into song. Oh, the situation doesn't please me. No, it's definitely not for me. And sorry, Marita, for my bad singing. Meanwhile, Tevela pranced around, coming close to falling into the kneading trough. Zubak was miserable. He felt like he'd landed in the depths of hell. And it really was the depths of hell. Sparks flew from the open oven. Sversky, covered in soot from head to toe, was holding a hearth broom. Sneke and Tevela sang and danced around Zubak like demons. You wouldn't want to think of them in the middle of the night. Zubak shuddered. He felt like he was about to pass out. The kneading trough was no longer a trough, but had, heaven help him, turned into a keg of tar. Sneke and Tevela were about to grab him, throw him into the tar, and boil him alive. The pair completed their concert and waited eagerly to hear what Zubak had to offer. Zubak's first thought was to rain down all the curses of hell on their heads and then spit into the full trough. But instead, he just turned around and made for the door. His exit would have been dignified had he not come close to tripping over a shovel. Sversky was the first to realize they'd gone too far. He ran after Zubak, shouting through the open door, Zubak, a gesundheit, wir haben gar nicht gemeint. Zubak, I hope you're okay. We didn't mean anything. It was just a joke, that's all. Zubak walked to the gate without saying a single word to Sversky, who went back to the oven and flew into a rage with his apprentices. Put the bread into the oven, you two. Verbrennt soll ihr werden, may you be burnt alive. You had to put on a performance and torment a man for no good reason. Zubak rang the janitor's bell like the building was on fire, waking everybody. One of the neighbors yelled, as soll herabfallen von alle Treppe, that he should fall down all the flights of stairs and break his neck. Zubak was so angry he couldn't speak. He hurried to his room, undressed in the dark, got into bed, pulling the comforter over his head, and in bloody red ink inscribed in his mind, I'll teach those bakers a lesson, those jerks. All night long, Zubak talked to Blue Streak. He dreamt that Sversky was playing Hamlet's dead father, and all the lines that no one had entrusted Zubak to speak on stage tore from his mouth. When Zubak awoke in the morning, he was hoarse. He was so angry he almost cried. This was a bad day to be hoarse. The troupe would be auditioning the roles for a new play, and he intended to fight like a lion for a part. When he remembered the events from the night before in the bakery, the affront burned in him like a shot of brandy on an empty stomach. Zubak sat at the edge of his bed, taking stock of his situation. It's an actor's fate to have some bumbling fool act all palsy-walsy and play jokes on me, instead of saying respectfully, "Good evening, Mr. Zubak. Go on through, but slowly, so you don't get any flour on you." Zubak felt like crying, but the tears didn't come. Thank you.
Great. Karpanovitz is known for his humor, which certainly comes out there. As far as language, I mentioned earlier the Polish language playing into the story of the first one, Zamate. But another aspect of this is the fate of Yiddish in Israel, where where Israelis, for the most part, wanted to ensure the domination of Hebrew as the national language of Israel, and thereby hangs a tale. Okay, our fourth speaker is Gordon Mott, known to all here, I think. Gordon Mott is a Vancouver-based writer who lived in Lithuania in the 1990s. He's written 3 historical fictions based in Lithuania, including the novel Lithuanian Lullaby. His Lithuanian trilogy focuses on the independence struggle and life in the newly liberated nation. We're talking 1990, 1991, in the struggle for independence, Lithuania being the first of the so-called Soviet socialist republics to declare independence at that time. And I think that Gordon will also give us some more background in depth on book smuggling in Lithuania during the latter part of the 1800s up to 1904. So here is Gordon.
Thanks, Gene. It's kind of a negative topic talking about progression of culture and literature, and there's been some wonderful presentations where we're celebrating those languages and culture. I think it might be interesting to start with something a little bit more positive. For Lithuania, this is a time of tremendous renaissance. I've been a Baltic watcher for 30 years, and I was surprised to turn on the television the other day and listen to watch 60 Minutes, which is an American CBS program that comes on weekly here, and where they were discussing Lithuania as being one of the free capitals of Europe, where they've extended their arms to Ukrainians and Belarusians and Russians who are fleeing persecution, and they're coming to Lithuania. And at the same time, Lithuania is punching well above its weight for such a tiny country in terms of its security contributions to Ukraine. I think in terms of percentage of GDP, I think they're number 3 or 4 in giving aid to our Ukrainian brothers and sisters. We've also, and indeed in their spend, their NATO spend, I think there's always concern about NATO spend being at least 2%. I think Lithuania it's almost double that. So again, a big contribution to the security of Europe. And even economically, Lithuania has a long history of trading. And I'll tell you the story. A year or 2 ago, I was in East London, Stratford, where I used to live many years ago, and walked into the local shopping mall, only to find a Lithuanian chain of food stores that was open in the local shopping mall in East London. The other day, in a suburb of Vancouver, we went into a shop, and it was piled with Lithuanian products, many of which came from the city of Knygnešio, where my wife Asta comes from. And I can tell you, when she held those pickles in her hand from the Knygnešio factory, there was tears in her eyes. So this is a country that has evolved and has experienced so much repression, has come out in this kind of wonderment, coming from the mists of Europe. Although it's the center, technically the center of Europe, it's really the fringe of Europe, the dividing line now between autocracy to the east and freedom to the west. So it's a fantastic time for this country. On the other side of things, so you've probably been watching this savage war in Ukraine, and you may have noticed the domestic impacts in Russia. So as this war has progressed, we've seen really the dismantling of civil society. We've seen free speech disappearing. We've seen opposition leaders disappearing, either being murdered or imprisoned or in exile. And we've seen a return to Soviet-era propaganda, a fake election. We're also seeing, as we did this weekend, other groups trying to take advantage of that weakness that Russia's experienced at that moment to inflict even additional pain to Russia. This phenomenon isn't new, and there's a strange rhythm to Russian history that revolves around seemingly regrettable decisions to engage in foreign military conquest, which are then followed by domestic changes. And for the 19th century and a good chunk of the 20th century, occupied parts of Lithuania are impacted by these strange rhythms of history. So as Jean mentioned at the outset, and Marita had done her reading, in 1864, the ban on Lithuanian books occurred shortly after an attack Russia had commenced on the Ottoman Empire. Now, the justification for the attack on the Ottomans was about how a dispute had been handled in the Holy Land. So there was a dispute between Christians and Orthodox over access to religiously significant buildings, and the Ottomans had intervened and brought both sides to the table, and they'd come out with an agreement. And the agreement seemed to satisfy both sides, but it did not satisfy the Tsar, who wanted to see the Orthodox be under his protection. So he takes the opportunity to attack the Ottoman Empire. And again, this was I've explained sort of the background, but really this was a land grab. They attacked part of the Ottoman Empire in what is now Romania. And it was a humiliating affair. Both Britain and France became involved, and it's not only a defeat for Russia, it drained Russia's coffers to the point that the Tsar put Alaska up for sale. So during this period, the after-war period, the Polish and Lithuanian rebels sensed an opportunity to orchestrate a rebellion. Unfortunately, not a successful rebellion. And following that rebellion, not dissimilar to today, the Tsar intervenes in a very heavy-handed way, prohibits Lithuanian literature, prohibits the teaching of Lithuanian language, and outlaws the Latin script. In fact, there's even some tolerance for Lithuanian being written in Cyrillic script, so there are some strange books out there, but no tolerance for Lithuanian written in its own language. It was essentially an attempt to remove the Lithuanian from Lithuania. And fortunately, Klaipėda region, Žemaitija, the Klaipėda region, remained under Prussian control, and residents there were able to smuggle books into the occupied Russian territory of Lithuania. So 40 years later, we have a very similar occurrence. In 1904, Russia's involved in a dispute with Japan, over a Japanese proposal. And the Japanese proposal was to cede spheres of influence in the Pacific. They wanted sole ownership over the Korean Empire, and they were willing to cede some authority over Manchuria to Russia. And the Tsar reacts in an unfortunate way. He sends a counter proposal in which he makes it clear he wants to take more of the Korean peninsula. And Japan interprets that as a declaration of war. And they attack Russian forces in the Pacific and do quite a bit of damage. There is a way for Russia to get out of that. Japan comes back to them later and says, well, if you can see our viewpoint, we're done with you. But Russia prolonged that. And it was a very dangerous mistake, because just like in 1864, when we had the Lithuanian rebellion, this is a bad time to show weakness internationally. And there are groups across the Russian Empire, workers' groups, agricultural laborers, who seize the opportunity to dissent. And in Lithuania, the book ban, which was never very effective, is lifted. The Tsar goes through a number of concessions. So at this point, he's too weak to become authoritarian and quell resistance. So what he does is he sets up a Duma, State Duma, which he routinely ignored and dissolved a couple of times. And he also provides some more rights to workers, and indeed for ethnic minorities like the Lithuanians, the book ban is lifted. but it's really too little and too late. So in 1905, we see the first Russian revolution. And a few years later, in 1917, another one, which is more successful, and ultimately leads to Lithuania's restored independence in 1918. So I'm about to read a passage from Lithuanian Lullaby about a Soviet slaughter of the Vilnius television tower in 1991. So this is the year after independence is declared. And the origin of that independence, and indeed the origins of the revolutions across Central Europe, begin with a decision to invade Afghanistan in 1979. And the decade that follows is a battle against an enemy that the Soviet Union cannot defeat. And across Central and Eastern Europe, we start to witness again significant internal dissent, originally in Poland and then spreading across the region. And the tight propaganda network that had existed since Stalin starts to collapse, with conscripts bringing home news of the catastrophe in Afghanistan and news of Poland's solidarity actions spreading rapidly. So Soviet authorities in the 1980s originally react by offering concessions, not dissimilar to the Tsar in 1904. So glasnost and perestroika are introduced to liberalize free speech and economics. However, these concessions actually fueled more revolt than quell it. So the Soviets tried a different tact in January 1991 in Lithuania. And it may have been inspired by the events in China, where the authorities had violently ended a demonstration in Tiananmen Square in 1989. The following passage describes the Soviet assault on the television tower through the eyes of a fictional character, Darius, a former Soviet conscript, but also makes mention of Loretta. Now, Loretta Asnavachute is a 23-year-old seamstress who's one of the 14 people killed that day and the only woman to sacrifice her life. The next day, it seemed like the whole nation took to the streets. Soviet troops attacked a number of other targets. Demonstrators were able to foil at least one. With local police assistance, the police station in Vilnius was saved. The protests were working. Soviet progress was slowing. It was not the case for long. In the wee hours, the Soviet master plan went into force. The Soviet scheme was simple. Take all independent television broadcast facilities and put them off the air. Controlling propaganda would be key to undermining the rebels. The plan was to dispense fake news to confuse the rebels and reassure the population that their masters had their best interests at heart. Soviet tanks rolled toward the main television tower in Vilnius. Darius and his neighbors were ready for them. They suspected they were up to something. They shouted and pushed. Keep going, thought Darius. They won't shoot us. We've got cameras on them. We'll broadcast it to the world. They wouldn't dare. It was the middle of the night. Thousands of protesters encircled the television tower, while dozens of tanks encircled the crowd. Darius heard shots fired. They're just trying to scare us, he wagered. Then it happened. A tank drove directly into the protesters. Live ammunition was fired at the crowd. Chaos erupted. It was Tiananmen Square revisited. At first, Darius ran for cover. Then anger overtook him. He'd fought with these bastards and knew they were incompetent. He'd run back toward the tower to see if there was an opportunity for sabotage. As he ran through the tear gas, he tripped. Loretta? Asked Darius. There was no response from the young woman who lay on the ground. She was his neighbor. Loretta, can you hear me? Loretta's eyes opened and closed again. We need help, shouted Darius. We need a medic, something. There was no response. Only the sound of chaos continued around them. Help, he shouted. He now realized he was too close to the action. The tear gas had penetrated his lungs. Only his adrenaline and his previous experience with the gas had mitigated the effects on him. He could see there was blood coming from her shoulder. It was hard to ascertain if it would be safe to move her. Then he thought again, if I don't move her, they are likely to run over. Both coughed from the effects of the gas. Darius scooped up his neighbor in his arms and abandoned his quest for the tower. He ran to a local bus stop where Sąjūdis supporters were attempting to regroup. A few ran toward Darius when they saw his human cargo. An ambulance had been waiting at a distance, and one of the Sąjūdis supporters waved at it. The ambulance only took a minute to arrive from the shadows. Loretta died in hospital the next day.
Thank you. Okay. Gordon Mott from Lithuanian Lullaby. We've reached the end of our speakers list, and I'd like to conclude by seconding what Gordon had to say about the efforts not only of Lithuania, but neighboring Estonia and Latvia, and being really bulwarks against Russian invasion, Russian aggression towards Ukraine. And it's true that the Baltic countries have done way more proportionally beyond their capacities in some ways to help Ukraine and provide a joint defense. Sure, as members of NATO and the European Union, but also more recently a joint defense line common to the three Baltic countries. And so I salute the efforts of Lithuania and others to maintain a free and democratic order in Europe. And the sacrifices are being made in Ukraine in particular. So we end our formal program, but I wonder if anybody has questions or comments. We have a few more minutes that we can do. I think I mentioned a couple of particular aspects of language that intrigued me. Żaneta's use of Polish, or her reading in Polish, as well as the fate of Yiddish in Israel, where you had obviously huge numbers of European Jews ending in Israel before and after World War II. The fate of Yiddish there in relation to Hebrew and the opposition of the Israeli establishment, for lack of a better word, to the flourishing of Yiddish. Thereby lies a very interesting tale about the denigration of language. So any comments here or questions? I think, like I say, we have a few more minutes for discussion. You can unmute yourself.
Can I make a question or a statement?
Sure.
Okay, I'm Lorraine Meltzer, and I became aware of book smuggling, which I didn't know existed, last fall before I paid my first ever visit to Lithuania, and hopefully not my last. I absolutely loved the country. And one of the books that I read in preparation was a young adult novel that some of your readers may be aware of, but if you're not, or some of the other people, if you have grandchildren, this is a wonderful way of introducing your grandchildren, young people, to this whole issue. And the book is called Words on Fire by Jennifer A. Nielsen, and it's about a child book smuggler in Lithuania, smuggling books into Poland and then back into Lithuania. So it's very readable, and it's got excitement, which young people would enjoy. So I just thought I'd put that out there.
Hey, thank you, Lorraine.
You're welcome.
I'm wondering if you could put that in the chat.
Okay, sure. Yep, I'll do that.
Thanks.
Yes, by the way, I'm glad you mentioned that because what I've done is I've put all books by these four readers in the chat. So if you're interested in pursuing the books that our readers today have presented, I sent those in 3 or 4 different postings in the meeting chat. Also a reminder that this event is brought to you by the Lithuanian community of British Columbia, which is open to all who have an interest in Lithuania and its background and membership free of charge is available. So if you are interested in joining the Lithuanian community, a couple of us here on the screen, the small screen, are members of the board, members of the community, and let one of us know. You can let me know. We also have a logo there for the Lithuanian community on the screen. Let Rachel Mines know, and we can get you in touch on that. Other questions, comments?
Jean, you were going to ask me about something with the Polish from the passage I read. I assume you were going to ask why it was Polish that was so dominant in the country.
Yeah, and whether or not that was banned by the Russian imperial authorities.
See, the thing is, there are two things I thought about. With the Polish and the Lithuanian Union, which was very, very lucrative and profitable for both countries, they doubled their size and they extended right to the Black Sea. With that union, the official languages in the 17th, 18th century, not quite 18th, but certainly 16th, 17th, because it lasted a long time, was Polish and Latin. So Lithuanian was not the official language. So this lingered on, I would expect, into the 19th century, where Polish was still the dominant language. And also you have to remember that Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia were taken. They were dominated, not just satellite countries of Russia. They were actually dominated by Russia all that time. So to get Lithuania was obviously, as I read, submerged, but Polish was still available. They were still able to publish in Polish in Poland. So I expect that she was talking about the Polish books coming from Poland, I would think, but I don't know for sure. I'm just speculating here.
Right. Yeah. The period when, for an enormous era, when the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth dominated Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Black Sea.
It did. Yep.
Yeah. I wonder, Helen, would you care to comment on the fate of Yiddish in Israel in relation to Hebrew? Because Karpanovitz continued to use what was very much a minority and, shall I say, denigrated language in Israel.
Yeah, so thank you for asking that, Jean. And I don't pretend to be an authority on this, but I can talk a little bit about what I know, which is there was a group. Well, firstly, it's really interesting to me that every writer wants to be read. Karpanovitch was absolutely fluent in Russian and Polish, and I'm told English. And yet he wrote in a language where he didn't have an audience. As Chava Rosenfarb, another Yiddish writer, said, my audience went up in the smoke of the crematoria. And so Karpanovitch made a decision to write in Yiddish when he really had other options, but his commitment was to his characters, I would say, and to preserving their language. And one of the things that Karpanovitch does in his writing is he's preserving Yiddish. So there'll be a story about a barber, and there's an incredible amount of vocabulary that is not available in Yiddish dictionaries about, all the accoutrements of the barbering trade. He has another story about pool, like billiards. And once again, he's got all this like billiard pool vocabulary. I mean, I didn't know what those words meant in English. I had to go to pool halls in Vancouver to get pool sharks to help me to translate, which was really a trip. So, his part of his work as a writer was really an acts of preservation. And there were a group of Yiddish writers who were grouped around Avram Sutzkever, who was I would say, kind of the leading light of that grouping. And Sutskever published a journal, Die Goldene Case,
Right.
for many years. And
Another Lithuanian.
Yeah.
yeah,
That's
The
commercial.
golden
Yeah.
key. The golden key.
yeah.
The golden chain.
So Karpinovich writes about how his decision to memorialize Jewish life in Vilna was very much Sutskever was his mentor, and Sutskever really encouraged him and supported him to do this writing at a time, as Jean said, where Yiddish was really denigrated, and the move within Israel was to highlight the Hebrew language, and Yiddish was seen by many as the language of Golas, the language of the diaspora, the language of oppression and annihilation. So yeah, it's interesting because when Sutskever died, can't remember exactly when that was. I'm not so
Not
good.
that long ago.
Not that long ago. So Sutskever was a giant of literary. I mean, the fact that he didn't win a Nobel Prize is like a crime. In part, he's hard to translate because he was playing with the language. But nobody went to his funeral. No official person from the Israeli government attended Sutskever's funeral. So that denigration of the Yiddish language, I mean, it began with the creation of the state of Israel, but it's still, there's still a struggle to have Yiddish honored in the way in which it should be, because there were a number of writers who wrote in Yiddish who lived in Israel.
Right. Right. It's part of the effort of the new Israel to create what you might call the new man, part of the gender, but a new order of people in a newly rebuilt Israel, and that Yiddish reminded them of, like you say, of the oppressed ghetto life of European Jews, notwithstanding the fact that such a huge percentage of Israeli settlers in the late 40s, 50s into the 60s were Mizrahi. They came from Arabic lands, from Morocco all the way to Iran. I just wanted
to add one thing, if it's okay. One of the things that Karpinovich does that's very interesting is he writes about the intersection of Vilna and Israel in a number of different places. Like he'll have characters appear from Vilna who are meeting characters who have moved to Israel, and he's looking at how those worlds connect with each other in ways that are very interesting.
Right, right. Very much worth reading. And I'd like to turn to Gordon and perhaps anyone else, Rachel, myself, in terms of, I guess, a last area that we could touch on, which is the role of language in current present day Lithuania, as well as Latvia and Estonia. And I'm talking about Russian speakers.
Mm-hmm.
So in Latvia in particular, there's been very strong efforts by the Latvian government to take people of, I guess, Russian origin, you could say, continuing to use the Russian language, and to Latvianize those people. And there's concerns about the presence of people of Russian origin there. So in Lithuania, much less so than in Latvia. But I wonder if you wanted to talk about the role of language in present day Lithuania.
Well, yeah, and it's an interesting topic, and you're correct in saying that it has been less of an issue with the Russian population Lithuania, mostly because the population has now something like 5%, right? So in Latvia and Estonia, those numbers are much, much higher. And the young Russians that live there, that have lived there since the occupation began, they're descendants of the occupiers. They often have a more European viewpoint than people in Russia Central. But there are a couple of areas of concern. So and one of them is so Lithuania not only has a Russian minority, but it has a significant Polish minority. And there's been a lot of friction in that community with the government over access to Polish language education. And Lithuania has to be very careful, because anything that they do to reduce the amount of Russian language education and encourage Lithuanian language education, they also have to do in the Polish community as well. So this is an issue. At the same point, there's, as I mentioned, there's this wonderful arms open approach to Belarusians and Russians and Ukrainians. There's also concern about all of these people from the Slavic-speaking countries re-emerging in Lithuania. It makes some people feel, uncomfortable that they worked so hard to restore their culture, and now this invasion has occurred, granted by people who are friendly to the ideals that Lithuania has tried to embrace. But that's a concern as well.
Right, and I think it's a factor in the upcoming referendum of the Lithuanian national government as to whether to permit dual citizenship, because people coming from many are refugees opposed to the Putin regime.
Absolutely. And, the referendum is also very interesting because most of the people that have been, so after the Declaration of Independence, Lithuania was very careful with their citizenship laws, and people who left were not necessarily welcome to return as citizens. That mostly stripped ethnic Lithuanians, if you will, of their citizenship. So you had this when they left because they fell in love and married, or because they had business opportunities and wanted to get another passport. Suddenly they found that they were that their former citizenship, land that they had lived in, their ancestors had lived in for generations, had been stripped from them. So at the same time where they had this welcoming, opening arms to refugees from across Eastern Europe, they have restricted their own citizens who have this lineage in the country from being citizens. And they have tried this referendum once before, and it passed, and it passed quite easily. But they have a strange, and I'm not an expert, Marita might know, but I think they have to have 50% of the overall eligible voters support the referendum. So that's a pretty high bar. If that's still in place for this referendum, it could fail again.
Yeah, I believe it is. We have somebody here, a couple of people here online, if they still are, who would know the exact percentage. But that's the trouble, is that you have to have that bar, that high percentage of the voter list participating, yay or nay, in the referendum. And so if anyone wants to chime in on that in the last remaining couple of minutes, that would be great. Otherwise, we will prepare to wind up.
I wanted to give a big thank you to each one of you. Very interesting. Rachel, I know I had the pleasure and honor of listening to her on EJW. Perspective, being born in Bucharest, Romania, and having parents who were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Timișoara. So their first language was Hungarian, second German, third Romanian. For me, Romanian was the first language, and I had to wrap my mind. So what I found very interesting in each one of your presentations was a historical context too. And it seemed to me the Baltic countries underwent, from what I understand from history, strong Russification after the Second World War. In terms of censorship, I left Romania. Basically, Ceausescu, our dear dictator, sold me to Israel, put the money in the Swiss account, sold me to Israel, and imposed that any book I take with me will only be printed after 1945. So it really was political censorship. Anything that was printed before the communists came to power did not exist in Romania. So I just wanted to give you an input from a different, my language is not Slavic, it is Latin, but it's very interesting and I feel enriched by each one of your perspective. Thank you.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much. That opens the door to another session. This has been another, may I say, quite successful event of the Lithuanian community of British Columbia. We have a steady diet of them the last several years, and we'll have many more in the future. We had a notable one last year on Lithuanians' role in NATO and military defense against Russia. We have obviously many face-to-face events as well. So just to recap, if you are interested in participating in our activities, this talk will be on YouTube in the future when we have time to post that.
Hope to make this a yearly event. Book Smuggling Day, Book Smugglers Day in Lithuania is March 16th. And around this time of year, next March, look for us again to hopefully, if all goes well, have a similar kind of event.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you and have a most pleasant afternoon. Thank you for joining us.